There's not a person on this earth that's worth over $100 million that came by that money. Honestly, why don't you take a look at the old money, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Gettys, the Morgans, the Hearsts, the Rockefellers. How do you think they got all that money? They just annexed territories and licenses and businesses and killed the native population and imported slaves and sold guns to both the North and the South during the Civil War and controlled the politicians. And they're heroes. They're American heroes.
And welcome once again to the ongoing saga of the working poor, Pitboss Review. This is Pat Pitboss for the Pitboss Review, your, whenever I put it out, update on current events and the decline of Western civilization as I know it, as I see it. And thanks for tuning in. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for paying attention, posting, liking, subscribing, reposting, all of that stuff. Like I said, I am Pat Pitboss, and these are this podcast is essentially just a couple things that I see happening around, well, I would say society, but realistically, if I say society, we're mostly talking about Central Canadian society and what we are fed on the media. And that's an interesting point, that living in Central Canadian society, we're not living in these huge sprawling urban metropolises. This is not Vancouver, this is not Toronto, this is not LA, this is not New York. I live in Saskatchewan, Saskatoon to be precise. But what I do know about the outside world comes from a lot of traveling and a lot of what we get in our programmed media. And people don't really think about this that much. When we think about media programming or television programming, the term programming that is put in place when we talk about these things. We are literally being programmed by the media that we choose to consume. And whoever is basically buying that program or paying for that advertising or paying for that network or the time that that network is taking up, you will get the programming that they decide is important for you to know. This is, it's once upon a time, we would think about news, right? News, the information coming from the north, the east, the west, and the south. News. And that made a lot of sense when we were, not in an age of information, when we had immediate access to what was going on outside our borders. Or so we think. And we would get newspapers telling us what was happening a town over or two towns over because we just didn't have the option to go visit there. But now that we're living in a time when information, content, well, I guess content, more than information, is available to us instantly with a click of a button. We pick up our little supercomputer we carry in our pocket, and we can get whatever information we want in the world, ideally, from anywhere that's actually putting out information. But what we forget is that all of this information goes through a number of filters. There's a great video on YouTube if you want to check this out. It's called Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky. It talks about the filters that media has to go through in order for it to reach the consumer. So we've got a producer and we have a consumer. The producer usually has an agenda. They have a narrative that they want to give to you. They don't necessarily want to give you a narrative that goes countercurrent against what they believe is real or what they believe they want you as the consumer to embrace or to believe. So this is the principle that I'm talking about with programming. So if we're living on one side of the world and there's an issue happening on the other side of the world, very, very seldom will we get a balanced context of nuance and history of what's going on there. And you can look this up over the years. This is the principle of propaganda. The principle of propaganda was put in place, or the principles were actually, the term was put in place by a gentleman by the name of Edward Bernay. And Edward Bernay was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst, Sigmund Freud, who studied psychology of the individual, psychology of the mass, and from the writings that Sigmund Freud put out, his nephew Edward Bernay wrote a treatise called Propaganda. And in the book Propaganda, he pointed out very clearly that the masses, the will and tastes of the masses, are being shifted by an unknown powers behind the throne. We don't even know why we buy the things we buy, why we like the things we like, why we find what we find attractive, and why we believe in what we believe, because we're continually being manipulated by people behind the media we consume to believe in a narrative, So one of Edward Bernay's most famous, I guess, media coups, just as an aside, Edward Bernay's after World War II changed his programming from being called propaganda to public relations, because that was a little more, I guess, palatable to the American conscience after what happened in World War II with the Nazi regime and the propaganda that happened there. So as part of his propaganda / public regime push, one of his major coups in the early, I guess, 20 suffragette movement was the cigarette companies came to Edward Bernays and they said, wow, we really want to up our sales and we want to try and figure out how we can get women to buy cigarettes. And so he went and he thought with his team, and they came back with a strategy that there was a large suffragette march of women marching to get the right to vote. And what they did is they intentionally planted cigarette smokers in the audience. And then the new movement was to take away the stigma that cigarettes were unladylike and replace it with cigarettes. Anything a man can do, a woman can do as well. And then, legitimately, the sale of cigarettes boosted almost by 50%. It's in the book Propaganda by Edward Bernays. Another element of this was, I believe, the animal agriculture lobby approached a very similar public relations firm, and they put the push onto media, onto commercials, to say bacon and eggs are the breakfasts of the American person. Bacon and eggs, they meet all of your satisfactory nutrition needs for the first day of the meal, which is now by modern science completely ridiculous, but the propaganda worked. So every Denny's, Smitty's, anything that you go into in Western Canada, bacon and eggs is kind of like the traditional breakfast for that exact reason. So I find this very interesting now, because almost everywhere I'm driving around, I'm seeing these blue and yellow flags from people who last week really didn't give two shits about what was happening in Ukraine. And I'm going to preface this by pointing out that I stand wholeheartedly against imperialism, against bullies, against anybody who's going to encroach on like the peaceful will of another person. That being said, we also live in reality, and our reality of geopolitical history that a lot of people aren't familiar with and are not really interested in seeing any further than what they're being served on the evening news and their information programming, and what they see on social media, which is information programming. Now, you might say, well, it's not information programming on Facebook or Twitter, because that's just an open forum where anybody with an opinion can have an opinion. Well, to a degree. Basically, anybody with an approved opinion can have an opinion on Facebook or Twitter, because if the algorithm recognizes what you're saying being controversial or against their quote-unquote community guidelines, you're deplatformed and you don't have a right to say your opinion. So you are no longer getting the balanced opinion or the balanced information that you might think you're getting. Now, at the same time, we could take a look at the Ukraine situation and look at it. Why are we getting such a heavy narrative here in the West for this country in Eastern Europe, who has no bearing on us at all? And the narrative that we're hearing, and it's a valid fucking narrative, it's an ethical and moral narrative, is that we need to protect those that cannot protect themselves from imperialism and from violence and from this lunatic bully who's just attacking them for no reason. Look at the crying baby, look at the bleeding mother, look at the married couple that are going off to fight. Right after they get married, they pick up their AK-47s and they head to the front to defend their homeland. All of these are such noble narratives that we are basically told to believe. Well, it's the only option that we are given to believe, because you will not see any of the Russian narrative happening on our media, to the degree that universities are now taking Russian philosophers out of their curriculum. So because they don't want that philosophy taught, because it somehow supports imperialism. The aeronautical what was it? I think the aeronautical um, museum removed the first person in space because he happened to be Russian. We're living in ridiculously choreographed times, and I'm surprised that people aren't seeing through this bullshit. Now, I don't want to get into the vaccine situation because, personally, I was vaccinated. I kind of felt for the better part that the safety of my community, my duty to a larger community, was more important than my selfish worry, and it worked out. I did catch COVID after getting 2 vaccinations, and I still do have lingering symptoms. But when we go back, the narrative that was pushed right before nobody talked about COVID anymore. Remember that? It was like Canadian truckers over in Ottawa are blocking off the streets, and now war. That never happened. Nobody wanted to talk about what actually happened in Ottawa. And one of the things that really set me off about this whole situation in Ottawa was the fact that we have a bunch of people going to, admittedly, it was civil disobedience. It wasn't a straight peaceful demonstration. It was a very lightly criminal behavior in order to press a political issue and to be listened to by the authorities, which isn't the first time. We had the sit-ins in the 60s. Like civil disobedience is a pretty common tactic. The Wet'suwet'en protests were another one that I supported. And the Wet'suwet'en protests, they blocked down, I guess, the train tracks all across Canada to basically shut down commerce. And everybody was so upset. We have to shut these down. We have to shut these down. And Justin Trudeau really sat and he tried to negotiate with these people to the degree until finally he said, look, you need to go. Now, this trucker rally, regardless of how Trudeau handled it, the thing that really got me on this side against the propaganda being pushed was a narrative that these guys are all Nazis. These guys are all Nazis because we saw 1 or 2 swastika flags being flown at this rally. To the point that my daughter came home from her grade 9 class and one of her teachers in a public school told her that if you're sitting at a table of 9 people and a Nazi sits at your table, then you are now sitting at a table and nobody kicks that Nazi out and makes him leave the table, then you are now sitting at a table of 10 Nazis. This was the narrative being taught to my daughter, and I heard it parroted on social media ad nauseum, that these people said if you see a swastika flag and that group doesn't kick that Nazi out, then they're all Nazis because they're tolerating Nazism. We need to take a hard stance against these truckers because it's a racist, misogynist, sexist movement, and they're against our fundamental values as peaceful, equality-loving Canadians because we saw those swastika flags. And I thought that was ridiculous because it's absolutely not true. Like that exact same logic is if you're in a reserve of 10, there's 10 people on a reserve or 9 people at a table at a reserve and one criminal sits down and they don't arrest that guy or send him away from the table, you're sitting at a table of 10 criminals. Does that logic carry? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Okay, so that's fine and dandy. I disagreed with that, but as I saw the propaganda from our government being pushed with this narrative, that we saw a couple Nazi flags, fascist flags being flown, so therefore their entire protest is Nazis. Then what happened, I don't know, what was it, 2 weeks later, when this new war started, or it wasn't even a war at the time. There was Russia deciding to invade Ukraine. It wasn't a war, it was an invasion, But we're being fed a narrative that these innocent people, these are the people whose side we need to take. You don't need to know the background on why Russia decided to invade Ukraine. You just need to put your blue and your yellow. Everybody's going to pat you on the back for virtue signaling. You're doing the right thing. Follow the leader. Do what you're told, and you're doing the right thing. It's fucking propaganda 101. But then, and Putin was out there when we were allowed to hear their side of the story, saying, look, this place is full of Nazis. You people aren't even listening to what the USA has been doing with NATO or any of this other stuff. And people are like, whatever, you fucking freak show barbarian. You're just invading innocent people. Regardless of Iraq, regardless of Afghanistan, regardless of never having weapons of mass destruction over there and bombing the shit out of those countries, these guys, Putin's a bad guy, Obama's okay, Bush is okay, whatever, Trump was a piece of shit, don't get me wrong, but like all of America's justifications for invading sovereign countries under false pretenses, those were good wars because these people stand against our freedom. Now over here in Ukraine, these are just freedom-loving people being invaded by a horde of barbarian lunatics that are just bullies and baby killers. That's the narrative that we're being told to believe. But then, we started seeing all of these media photographs being released with photos of Ukrainian soldiers with Nazi logos on their kit. We're seeing wolfsangles, which is a variation on a design, an old runic design that was co-opted by the SS in World War II. And we start seeing the Black Sun, or also known as the Sonnenrad, which was the design that they're using specifically isn't like traditional, European pre-colonial heritage. It is specifically the design used by Himmler in his little castle for the SS. He designed that, or the Nazis working with Himmler designed this version of the Black Sun explicitly for the SS use in the Nazi officers. And now we see picture after picture after picture after picture of Ukrainian soldiers with these exact same logos on their kit, on their uniforms. They're waving flags. They're actually waving flags, outright Ukrainian flags, superimposed over top of a Nazi battle flag with a swastika in the center. We're talking like the cross with the black lines, a swastika in the center, and then the top of it being blue and the bottom of it being yellow. So we're looking at a small mountain full of evidence saying that a significant, sanctioned, allowed division, or a couple of them, and individual soldiers in the Ukrainian military are suddenly wearing Nazi flags. They're wearing swastika flags. But I do not see the equal level of outrage as I did against the Canadian truckers when they saw 2 swastika flags at the trucker rally. And I find that incredibly interesting. What a double standard. And I started asking people about this. And one of my friends pointed out, and he sent me an article, and he's like, check this out. The swastika flags, at least one of them that they saw at the Ottawa rally, was a person saying this is the future that Trudeau wants for Canada. And he was basically saying that if Trudeau got his way, he would have a Nazi regime in Canada. And that's what the flag was. It was accompanied by signs that said this is the future that Trudeau wants for Canada with a swastika flag. That's not what's happening in Russia. There's a group called the Azov Detachment, and there's a few other ones. These people are dedicated, legitimately, the person that founded it is dedicated to securing a white European homeland away from what he calls Semitic influence. Semitic influence being just a fancy word for Jewish, right? And their logos are swastikas, the wolf's angle and the Sonnenrad. And nobody's calling these people out. And it was to the degree that on Twitter, and I've seen it, I had a copy, I saved the photo, maybe I can dig it up for the video. NATO on International Women's Day posted this photo for women, Ukrainian women, struggling for solidarity and equality. And they had 4 different photos of these different Ukrainian women, either hugging each other or getting ready to fight at the front. And the woman in the NATO photograph had a Sonnenrad patch on her chest. She was wearing a neo-Nazi patch on her chest. And now NATO, being a North American Treaty Alliance or whatever NATO is, basically, I'm going to give you a bit of a backstory here. During the Cold War, everybody was afraid of Russia and America. Like they were like neck to neck or nose to nose. Nuclear war was going to happen. Gorbachev and Reagan, like it was horrible. And NATO was started up with allied countries that made the claim that if one of us gets attacked, we all band together to fight off Russia, specifically Russia. And Russia had the USSR, the Warsaw Pact, to say these countries here are going to stand as a buffer from all of you NATO countries. And all of these countries on the west of Russia are going to be ruled by Russia. And if you have any issue, these countries are going to defend us. So NATO was to defend against Russia, and Russia had all of these countries to defend against NATO, essentially. And any NATO country had a U.S. military base. And these U.S. military bases had soldiers and missiles and tanks and all the equipment, plus any other NATO country they would have these bases right on their eastern front, right? Right against any country that was a NATO country. So when the Cold War ended and Russia and America went into talks about shutting down NATO. You don't need to defend against us anymore. We believe in freedom. We're going to give back, all these countries to their sovereignty. It really boiled down. If I have this correct, you could check this, but I'm pretty sure it boiled down to what they were going to do with Germany, East Germany and West Germany. West Germany being a NATO, Americanized, and East Germany being Russia controlled. And I believe Gorbachev and Reagan basically, or Gorbachev and the U.S. made the agreement that if Russia withdrew from Germany and it became a democratic, Western country, then they would disband NATO because there's no reason to. Look, we're backing off and you guys back off. But they didn't do it. And then between 1989 and 2020, NATO kept moving their borders. They kept recruiting newer and newer countries, closer and closer to the Russian borders, including a couple countries directly on the border of Russia, which allows American missiles and American forces to move closer and closer towards encroaching on Russia's sovereignty. Like, this was the Cuban Missile Crisis when you think about it with, I believe, JFK, when Russia wanted to put missiles in Cuba. It was a huge deal. They said, like, we're not going to tolerate Russian missiles off the border of Cuba. The same way that Russia says we are not going to tolerate NATO missiles in the Ukraine. So over the last so many years, I don't know exactly how many, Ukraine has been either offered or considering joining NATO, regardless of this being a violation of what was agreed upon there's documents saying this is a violation of what was agreed upon in 1989. So that part isn't being talked about as Russia or those elements, the neo-Nazis or the NATO issue, as Russia says, look, if you're going to try and take NATO and move your forces into Ukraine, we're taking Ukraine. That's what we'll do then. Now, I'm not saying it's acceptable at all. What I am saying is we need to have balanced information surrounding what is actually happening over there. And we're not. We're being fed a program. And the more I see these fight for Ukraine, I stand with Ukraine, I stand with anti-imperialism, I stand with this, I stand with that, the more I recognize the hypocrisy involved. Because you are basically parroting whatever has been fed to you by your media. And who is feeding the media? Where is that money coming from? Something that's actually a very interesting, relation to this, a very interesting parallel to this, is the very, very brief and the less media pushed I Stand with Palestine that happened a little while ago. And for those people that aren't aware, Israel has been encroaching and violently invading a sovereign nation of Palestine for the past 70 years. Now, the issue when this comes into play is that Canada and America and Britain literally give billions of dollars a year to support Israel's existence in their imperialist, genocidal, apartheid state that every other, ethical country in the world has called out as being an imperialist apartheid state. America and New Zealand and Australia and all of these countries support what's going on in Israel. One narrative that I heard that was very valid was if these countries ever stood out against Israel, they have to recognize their own colonial imperialist nature themselves, and they don't want to do that. The other one that's very interesting is we're never given that side of the story. You will never see a Hollywood movie about the plight of the Palestinian people. Very rarely, unless you're watching Al Jazeera News, will you hear about the plight of the Palestinian people on your radio, on your television, in any movie, on any mainstream media news outlet. Because largely, these people that are behind the throne they support a Zionist state in Israel. Those people that own these media conglomerates, if you look up, I think there's something like 7 major media conglomerates in the world, one being Japanese, and I think the other 6 are very much openly supportive of the Zionist cause in Israel. But we won't hear that because the narrative that we're being fed, that propagandized idea of mass psychology that Sigmund Freud and Edward Bernay talked about, has told us that those Arabs and those Muslims are the bad guys. They stand against our freedom. They are the worst thing ever. And we have a right to have a military outpost. I think it's like the 4th or 5th largest, most well-armed army in the world in Israel on our dime. Now, that apartheid state is acceptable. As a matter of fact, you'll hear all over the place people debating the merits of whether Israel should be in Palestine because it's their holy land. They lived there 2,000 years ago and they're there to reclaim it or something like that. But here we are in 2022, balls deep, watching another country do the exact same thing, an invasion of Ukraine, and everybody is all about the victim. What about the victim? What about the victim? Something I'd like to point out, the European victim has blonde hair and blue eyes. The Palestinian victim has brown skin and brown eyes. Does that factor into anything? When we can feel empathy for those people that look like the Aryan ideal that we're fed on, I guess, the evening news versus the brown guy that has been in the movies for the last 25, 30 years as being the enemy, the terrorist, the bad guy, the Muslim fundamentalist. So I really think people need to start taking a look at what we're ingesting, because everything that goes in your eyes and your ears and in your culture, look at advertising, has been bought and paid for by somebody to sell you something or to convince you of something. This is the principle of propaganda, and I'll continue to talk about it as long as I have the Pitboss review going on. We need to start stepping away from the indoctrination that they keep trying to shove into us, non-consensually, without our consent, or without even our knowledge, and start looking at things through a lens of balance and non-propagandized bias. Because the bias that we allow ourselves to hold is holding us back from living in reality. So we live in a system like this where a lot of people are making a lot of money off of the little man. The system of capitalism, the system of exploitation, the system of keeping us on the ground, and it seems inescapable. Like we can never get out from underneath it. But then again, so did, once upon a time, the divine rule of the kings and the landowners and the lords and the knights over the serfs and the peasants. At the time, that seemed like an inescapable situation, that power could not be challenged and we couldn't get out from under it. But with unification, solidarity, and united struggle, we were able to change that. But one of the first things that we need to do is recognize, or did need to do, is recognize that the kings didn't have divine right. That was propaganda. God did not place the kings in power over everybody else. They claimed it through vicious, violent, bloody executions and coercion and theft. So if you want to be a moral person, I really advocate getting out from underneath the propaganda hail that we see ourselves under. The increasing move towards really skewed values. And I see this left and right happening in our society, brothers and sisters. Warriors out there, I see it happening all over in society. I see the increasing sexualization of children. I see the increasing superficial hyper superficial materialism being promoted by a media, that how you look, how long your nails are, what kind of car you drive, what kind of brand names you wear are more important than the values you hold in your heart. This is profoundly against almost every philosophy that we've had for thousands of years, and it's directly responsible for the environmental and social decay that we see in our society today and in our globe. It's going to be the death of us. I guarantee you. Public relations is hypnosis by another word. Propaganda is hypnosis by another word. They subtly change your belief systems to believe and accept whatever they sell you is reality. And as long as you are consensually taking in their media, you will continue to be hypnotized, and you will continue to be sucked into their reality and buy whatever they're selling you, whether it's political, social, environmental, whatever. And you will always barely survive and never rise up the ladder to become your true self, because they don't want you to be a free, aware, feral individual anymore. They want livestock. They don't want you to hop the fence and run off into the bushes and learn to live. They want you within the structure. So these are things I was thinking about today, things that I saw when I was cruising down my Instagram feed. If you're interested, follow me, Pat Pitboss, at Instagram. Yeah, if you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe. Any questions or concerns, no hate mail, please. I'll just delete your ass. Leave them below. Press the like button. Share with friends. Hope to see you come back in the future. Have a good day. Peace, love, and granola.